if we analyze this definition, maybe an act that is doing of something. In this sense, consideration is an affirmative form. Example, A promise B to guarantee payment of a price of the goods which B sells on credit to C. Here selling of goods by B to C is consideration for A's promise. The act must not, however, be one which is under a legal duty to perform. This point has been explained further. Second, an abstinence or forbearance, that is, abstain or refrain from doing something. In this sense, consideration is in negative form. A promises B not to file a suit against him if he pay rupees 5,000. The abstinence of A is the consideration for B's payment. Third point of analysis, a written promise. A agrees to sell his horse to B for rupees 10,000. Here B promises to pay the sum of rupees 10,000 is the consideration for A's promise to sell the horse, and A's promise to sell the horse is the consideration for B's promise to pay the sum of rupees 10,000. So why there is a need for consideration? The reason why the law enforces only those promises which are made for consideration is that gratuitous or voluntary promises are often made rashly and without the due deliberation. The law looks for disfavor upon an exchange of promises which would result in one of the parties obtaining something for nothing. It supplies no means nor afford any remedy to compel the performance of an agreement made without sufficient consideration. If A promises to pay B rupees 1,000 for nothing, B neither doing nor promising to do anything in return to compensate A for his money, A promise has no force in law. Likewise, an offer made containing a promise not to revoke it and keep it open does not prevent the offerer from revoking the offer if it is not supported by the consideration. So this particular detailed discussion states the objective of what is in consideration. In slide, we will focus on the concept of legal rule as to consideration. The summary discussion which we have seen so far about the meaning of consideration is when a party to an agreement promises to do something, he must get something in return. This something is defined as a consideration. So legal rule as to consideration. The first rule says that it must move at the desire of a promiser. An act constituting consideration must have been done at a desire or request of the promiser. If it is done at the instance of third party or without the desire of the promiser, it will not be a good consideration. Example, A saves B's goods from fire without being asked to do so. Here, A cannot demand payment for his services. In one of a famous case of Durga Prasad versus Baldev, B spent some money on the improvement of the market at a desire of the collector of the district. In consideration of this, D, who was using the market, promised to pay some money to B, held the agreement was void, being without consideration, as it had not moved at the desire of the D. So here the first point, that it should move at the desire of the promiser is very clearly evident. Second, it must move by the promisee. Under the English law, consideration must move from the promisee. Under the Indian law, consideration may move from the promisee or any other person, that is, even as a stranger. This means that as long as there is a consideration for a promise, it is immaterial who has furnished it. But the stranger to the consideration will be able to sue only if he is a party to the contract. One of a famous case of Chinnaya versus Ramaya, An old lady, by deed of gift, made over certain property to her daughter D, under direction that she should pay to her aunt P, that is sister of old lady, a certain sum of money annually. The same day, D entered into an agreement with P to pay her the agreed amount. Later, D refused to pay the amount on the plea that no consideration had moved from P to D. Held, P was entitled to maintain a suit as a consideration had moved from the old lady, that sister of P, to the daughter D. So here again it is once again seen that the consideration was moved by the promisee in English law, and in Indian law by promisee or any other person if it is a party to the contract. The third legal rule is it may be an act, abstinence or forbearance or a written promise. This has already we have discussed that the particular thing which we have discussed is that a good consideration for a contract. So any act, any abstinence or any forbearance. So what is a forbearance to sue? If a person who could sue another for the enforcement of the right agrees not to pursue his claim, this constitutes a good consideration for a promise by another person. This result in a benefit to the person not sued and a detriment to the person who could sue. Example, A borrows from B rupees 1000 at 20% per annum but fail to pay the amount. When B is about to file a suit, A agrees to pay higher rate of interest. B as a result does not file the suit. This forbearance on the part of B to file a suit is a sufficient consideration, and B can enforce the promise by A to pay the higher rate of interest. Next, or a written promise. So here a written promise can be in the form of any disputed claim with respect to any creditors. Like in the case of disputed claim, compromise can be a written promise. Compromise is a kind of forbearance. As such, the same principle as discussed applied to the bona fide compromise of a dispute claim, even though ultimately it might appear that the claim was wholly unfounded. But originally the claim should be reasonable, and the person claiming should honestly believe that it is a valid claim. He should also act bona fide. If it turned out to be claim was frivolous and the claimant was not acting bona fide, the other party can claim the compensation. That is the written promise. Fourth point, it may be past, present or future. The word used in section 2 subsection D, has done or abstained from doing, that is past, or does or abstain from doing, present, or promises to do or to abstain from doing, future, something. This means consideration may be past, present or future. Past consideration, when consideration by a party for a present promise was given in a past, that is before the date of the promise, it is said to be a past consideration. Example, A renders some services to B at a later desire. After a month, B promises to compensate A for the services rendered to him. It is a past consideration. A can recover the promised amount. Next is present or executed consideration. When a consideration is given simultaneously with promise, that is at the time of promise, it is said to be present consideration. In a cash sale, for example, consideration is a present and executed. Example, A received rupees 5000 in return for which he promises to deliver certain goods to B. The money he receives is the present consideration for the promise he makes to deliver the goods. Next is future or executory consideration. When consideration from one party to the other is to pass subsequently to the making of the contract, it is a future or executory consideration. D promises to deliver certain goods to P after a week. P promises to pay the price after fortnight. The promise of D is supported by the promise of P. Consideration in this case is a future or executory, that is, which will be done in the coming future. Fifth, it need not be adequate. Consideration, as already explained, means something in written. This something in written need not necessarily be equal to the value of something given. The law simply provides that the contract should be supported by consideration. So long as consideration exists, the court are not concerned as to its adequacy, provided it is of some value. The adequacy of the consideration is for the parties to consideration at the time of making the agreement, not for the court when it is sought to be enforced. Example, A purchased from B an old table for rupees 500. It will be difficult, if not impossible task, for the court to ascertain whether the price paid was adequate or not, or whether the table was worth of the price paid. So what is important is that consideration should be there, adequacy is a later part. Sixth point, it must be real and not illusory. Although consideration need not be adequate, it must be real, competent, and of some value in the eyes of law. There is no real consideration in the following case. Example, physically impossibility. A promises to put life into B's dead wife, should pay him rupees 5 lakh. A promises is physically impossible to performance. So this is a physically impossibility. Legal impossibility. A owes rupees 1000 to B. He promises to pay rupees 5100 to C, the servant of B, who in return promises to discharge A from the debt. This is legally impossible because C cannot give discharge for a debt due to B, that is his master. Next is uncertain consideration. A engages B for doing certain work and promises to pay a reasonable sum. There is no recognized method to ascertain the reasonable remuneration. The promise is unenforceable as consideration is uncertain. Next is illusory consideration. Two of the crew of a ship deserted in halfway through the voyage. The captain thereby promises to divide the salary of the deserter among the rest of the crew if they worked the vessel home. Held, they could not recover the amount of consideration as it was illusory. They were already under an obligation to bring the vessel at home. So this is a illusory, which is not a real consideration. Last point to the legal rule as consideration, it must be something which the promisor is not already bound to do. Like in above case, we have seen that already the crew of a ship were at obligation to bring the vessel at home. So it should not be already bound to do. A promise to do what one is already bound to do, either by general law or under the existing law, is not a good consideration for a new promise. Hence, since it add nothing to the pre-existing legal or contractual obligation. Likewise, a promise to perform a public duty by a public servant is not a consideration. And most important, that it must not be illegal, immoral, or opposed to public policy. The consideration given for an agreement must not be unlawful. Where it is unlawful, the court do not allow an action on the agreement. This point is already explained by us or discussed by us under the legality of object.